It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of struggling to find a safe and welcoming community for my blind son, Ethan, we finally moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. The houses were pristine, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the streets lined with tall oak trees. It seemed like the ideal place for Ethan to grow up, to feel independent, and to thrive. But little did I know, our new beginning would soon turn into a nightmare. Ethan, who had lost his sight in a car accident when he was just 8 years old, had finally found a sense of independence with his guide dog, Max. Max wasn't just a dog. He was Ethan's eyes, his confidence, and his lifeline to the world. The bond between them was unbreakable, and I had promised Ethan that no one would ever take Max away from him. That promise would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. 3 weeks after moving in, I found a certified letter on our doorstep. The envelope bore the official letterhead of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. My heart sank as I read the words. Unauthorized pet on premises violates HOA Regulation 7.3. Remove animal within 72 hours or face daily fines. They weren't even calling Max a service animal. They called him a pet. When I told Ethan, his hands started shaking. "Dad, they can't take Max." "They just can't," he said, his voice cracking as he clutched Max's harness. I could see the fear in his face, the fear of losing the one thing that gave him independence. I promised him again that no one would separate him from Max. But I had no idea how hard that promise would be to keep. The next day, Ethan wanted to swim at the community pool. I thought it would help take his mind off things. Max sat dutifully at the pool's edge while Ethan swam laps, something he had gotten good at since losing his sight. That's when she made her grand entrance. Margaret Hayes, the president of the HOA, strode into the pool area like she owned the place. "Dogs are not permitted in the pool area," she announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "It's a health code violation." I approached her calmly. "Ms. Hayes, Max is a certified service animal. The ADA laws exempt him from these rules." She interrupted me, her voice dripping with contempt. "I know all about people who abuse service animal policies. Those glasses are just for show, aren't they?" she said, pointing at Ethan. "I've seen him looking at his phone. This is all a scam to break the rules." Ethan froze in the pool, hearing every word. The other families fell silent, watching uncomfortably. My blood boiled. "My son is legally blind," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "How dare you? We all have problems," Margaret snapped. "I have arthritis, but you don't see me bringing a pony to the pool for therapy." That's when Mr. Rodriguez, a 70-year-old veteran who lived down the street, stepped forward. He had been quietly reading in the corner. "That's enough, Margaret," he said firmly. "You know damn well that's a service animal, just like my sergeant was for my PTSD. Are you going to kick me out too?" Margaret's face flushed. She hadn't expected anyone to challenge her. "This isn't over," she hissed at me before turning on her heel. "The board will hear about this." As she stormed away, Mr. Rodriguez gave me a knowing look. "Watch yourself with that one. She doesn't like losing." Ethan climbed out of the pool, his hands finding Max, who immediately licked his face. "Dad," he whispered, "why does she hate Max so much?" I didn't have an answer then, but I would soon discover that this was about much more than just a dog. After the confrontation at the pool, my military training kicked in. When facing an enemy, gather intelligence and strike strategically. That evening, I called our family attorney, who specialized in disability rights. "This is a federal case now," she said after reviewing Max's certification papers. Armed with legal ammunition, I demanded an emergency meeting with the entire HOA board, not just Margaret. If she wanted to play by the rules, I'd show her exactly what federal law trumped her precious HOA handbook. The community center buzzed with tension that evening. Neighbors I'd never met showed up in support, whispering about Margaret's previous victims. Margaret sat at the center of the board table, arms crossed, with that same smug expression I was beginning to despise. I slammed down a folder 3 inches thick, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I began, placing Max's ADA certification on the table. "As you can see, Max is a fully certified service animal, protected under federal law. I've also brought Ethan's medical documentation and a letter from our attorney explaining how the Fair Housing Act supersedes HOA regulations in cases like ours." Margaret barely glanced at the papers before pushing them away. Anyone can buy a vest online and print fake papers, she said dismissively. This doesn't prove anything. Miss Hayes, I replied, maintaining my composure. These documents are signed by licensed professionals. Max underwent 2 years of specialized training. That's when I pulled out my phone and played the video I'd recorded the day before. It showed Max guiding Ethan through an obstacle course at the park, expertly navigating him around barriers that would challenge anyone with sight. Does that look fake to you? I asked the room. Several board members leaned forward, clearly impressed. My cousin's Chihuahua can do tricks too, Margaret scoffed. The rules clearly state that federal law supersedes your rules, I interrupted. Or would you prefer we involve the Department of Justice? Discrimination against service animals carries penalties of up to $150,000. For a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. 2 board members exchanged glances. We'll need to review these materials, said George, the HOA treasurer, taking the folder from me. Personally, I don't see the issue with a properly trained service animal. Thank you, I said, noticing Margaret's glare at George. As the meeting adjourned, board member Lisa pulled me aside. Hey, just so you know, you're not the first family she's targeted. But you're the first with such thorough documentation. Something about her tone made me curious. Has Margaret had issues with service animals before? Lisa looked around nervously. Let's just say there are rumors she once sued a neighboring HOA over service animal rights. Strange that she's fighting so hard against one now, isn't it? As we left, I noticed Margaret watching us intently. This victory felt temporary at best, but the bigger question haunted me. Why would someone who once fought for service animal rights now be so determined to remove one? I thought our documentation would end the matter. For 48 hours, there was silence. We won, Dad, Ethan said, actually smiling for the first time in weeks. I didn't have the heart to tell him that predators are most dangerous when cornered. On the 3rd morning, it began. A neon pink violation notice was stuck to our door like a declaration of war. I tore it down before Ethan could sense something was wrong. Monday, grass exceeds maximum height of 2.5 inches. Fine, $50. I measured our lawn with a ruler. 2.3 inches exactly. Tuesday, improper trash bin placement. Fine, $75. Our bins were precisely where they'd been for months. Wednesday, unapproved window coverings. Fine, $100. We had the standard beige blinds that came with every house in the neighborhood. None of these were legitimate. Our lawn service had just mowed. The trash bins were exactly where they should be, and our blinds were the standard beige that came with the house. This wasn't enforcement, it was targeted harassment. But that was just the beginning. Ethan started noticing something during his walks with Max. Dad, someone's following us, he told me one evening. I can't see them, but Max keeps looking back and getting tense. And I hear the same footsteps every time. I decided to join them the next day, and sure enough, there was Margaret, 50 yards behind us, taking photos with her phone. When she saw me spot her, she didn't even pretend to be doing anything else. I'm documenting unsafe behavior, she called out, her designer sunglasses reflecting the sun as she raised her phone higher. That dog yanked your son violently. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. What she was referring to was Max expertly steering Ethan around a broken section of pavement where another child had tripped and been injured last month, a repair the HOA, under Margaret's leadership, had repeatedly delayed. This stops now, I said, stepping between her camera and my son. You're stalking and harassing a disabled minor. That's not just an HOA violation. It's a felony in this state. She lowered her phone but stepped closer, her perfume overwhelming as she whispered. We both know what happens to dangerous animals. Euthanasia is the only safe option for a dog with aggressive tendencies. Max, sensing my tension, moved protectively between Ethan and Margaret. She jumped back dramatically. See? It's aggressive. Stay back, or I'll call the police. Go ahead, I challenged. Let's get law enforcement involved. I'm sure they'd be interested in your pattern of harassment. She stormed off, but I knew this wasn't over. The next morning, something unexpected happened. We woke up to find lawn signs had appeared throughout the neighborhood overnight. Service animals welcome here, and we support Ethan and Max. At least a dozen houses had them. Our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, waved from across the street. It was my idea, she said. My grandson has autism and uses a therapy dog. We're with you. That afternoon, A local reporter called. "We've heard about a community divided over a service animal issue. Care to comment?" Word was spreading. People were taking sides. For the first time, I felt we weren't alone in this fight. But that night, the anonymous call came. "Either the dog goes, or you'll regret it. Accidents happen to animals all the time." I installed security cameras the next day. This wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. This was about protecting my son and his guide dog from whatever Margaret might do next. I thought I knew who our friends were in the neighborhood. I was wrong. Susan Baker had been one of the first neighbors to welcome us. She brought casseroles, offered to help Ethan navigate the community, and seemed genuinely supportive. Her teenage daughter even volunteered to walk with Ethan and Max sometimes. So when she texted asking to meet privately at the park bench by the lake, I didn't suspect anything. I assumed she wanted to offer more support. "Thanks for meeting me," Susan said, glancing around nervously. "I wanted to talk to you before things get worse." "Worse? Has Margaret made more threats?" Susan sighed heavily. "Look, I need to be honest with you. I've been nominated for the board secretary position. Margaret's backing me." The words hit like a physical blow. "You're siding with her? After everything she's done to Ethan?" "It's not that simple," Susan whispered. "Margaret knows people at Animal Control. Her cousin works there. She's planning something big, and I thought you should know." "What exactly is she planning?" I demanded, my heart racing. Susan leaned closer. "She's going to stage an incident, get Max declared dangerous. Once Animal Control takes a service animal for aggression evaluation, it can take months to get them back, even if they're innocent." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And you're helping her with this?" "No, that's why I'm telling you," Susan insisted. "But I can't publicly oppose her either. She's destroyed people who cross her. The Jenkinses almost lost their home last year after challenging her." What neither of us realized was that Ethan had followed me to the park. He'd been practicing independent navigation with Max and stumbled upon our conversation. More importantly, he'd been recording audio on his phone for a mobility exercise his therapist recommended. I only discovered this when he approached us, his face pale with shock. "Dad," he interrupted, his voice shaking. "Max and I were practicing routes. I heard everything." Susan went white. "Ethan, You're going to let her take my dog?" His voice broke on the last word. "You're pretending to be our friend?" "I'm trying to warn you," Susan pleaded. While still taking her side, I pointed out. Ethan held up his phone. "I recorded it all for my therapy exercises. I record my walks to review later. That recording would prove invaluable later." We sent it to our lawyer immediately. The next day, Margaret herself showed up at our door with a plate of homemade cookies. "Peace offering," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, extending a basket covered with floral cellophane, including some homemade peanut butter treats for Max. My grandmother's special recipe. I noticed her hands trembling slightly, something I'd never seen in her confident demeanor before. Behind her perfect makeup, dark circles suggested sleepless nights. "How thoughtful," I said, not reaching for the basket. "But Ethan's allergic to peanuts. We have strict rules about food in the house." Her practiced smile vanished instantly. "You're making a dangerous enemy, rejecting my generosity." As she stormed off, I watched her purposely stumble near our lawn, accidentally spilling treats onto the grass. After she left, I collected each one, wearing gardening gloves. The vet's toxicology report later confirmed what I suspected. The treats contained antifreeze and macadamia nuts, a lethal combination for dogs. The war had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. And tomorrow would be even worse. Thursday started like any other day. Ethan left for school with Max faithfully guiding him to the bus stop. I headed to work, still disturbed by Susan's warning and Margaret's peace offering. I called Ethan twice during the day, just to make sure everything was okay. At 3:30 p.m., my phone rang. It was Mrs. Jenkins from across the street. "You need to come home right now," she said, her voice shaking. "Animal Control is here. They're trying to take Max." I've never driven so fast in my life. As I screeched into our neighborhood, I could see the white van with County Animal Control emblazoned on its side, parked in front of our house. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, and there was Ethan, my brave son, sobbing uncontrollably while clinging to Max's harness. A uniformed officer was trying to loop a catch pole around Max's neck. My son's knuckles were white as he refused to let go. "He's my guide dog," Ethan was shouting between sobs. "You can't take him. Please don't take him." I slammed my car into park and ran toward them. What the hell is going on here? The animal control officer, his name tag read Officer Dawson, looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Sir, we received a report that this dog attacked someone this morning. I have orders to impound the animal for evaluation. That's impossible, I said, catching my breath. My son was at school all day with Max. The dog never left his side. According to our report, the incident occurred at 7:45 a.m. at the community mailboxes. The complainant has photos of bite marks. I noticed Margaret standing across the street, phone raised, recording everything with a satisfied smirk on her face. Officer, I said as calmly as I could, that dog is a certified service animal, protected under the ADA. I have all the documentation inside. There was no incident this morning. My son and I were together getting ready for school. Ethan was still clutching Max, who remained perfectly calm despite the chaos around him. He's my eyes, Ethan pleaded, tears streaming from behind his dark glasses. Please don't take my eyes away. Officer Dawson hesitated, clearly conflicted. I understand, son, but I have orders. Based on a false report, I interrupted, pulling out my phone. We have security cameras covering our driveway and front yard. If Max allegedly attacked someone at 7:45 a.m., it would be on camera. By this point, nearly a dozen neighbors had gathered, many with their phones out, recording the confrontation. Mrs. Jenkins pushed through the crowd. I was at the mailboxes this morning, she announced loudly. Nothing happened. No dog attack. I've been collecting mail at that time for 15 years. Officer Dawson looked at the crowd, then at Margaret, still filming from across the street, then down at Ethan and Max. He unclipped the catch pole and stepped back. Sir, I need to call my supervisor. As he walked to his van to make the call, other neighbors stepped forward. We saw Ethan and Max at the bus stop this morning, said Mr. Chun. The dog was perfectly behaved. I have security camera footage of the mailbox area, added another neighbor. I'll email it to you right now. Margaret, realizing things weren't going her way, started walking toward her house, but not before Mrs. Jenkins pointed directly at her. She did this. She's been targeting this family since they moved in. She tried to get my grandson's therapy cat removed last year. Officer Dawson returned from his van, his expression serious. Sir, my supervisor wants to review the situation. For now, the dog can stay with you pending our investigation, but I'll need copies of all service animal documentation and any security footage you have. As the crowd dispersed and the animal control van drove away, Ethan finally released his death grip on Max's harness. The dog immediately licked the tears from his face. They almost took him, Dad, Ethan whispered. They almost took my eyes. I held them both close, rage and relief battling inside me. It's not over yet, I told him. But now everyone sees what she's really doing. And we're going to fight back. Little did I know, this public spectacle would finally expose Margaret's true nature to the entire community and reveal secrets she'd been hiding for years. The attempted seizure of Max became the catalyst that finally united our community. That evening, my phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from outraged neighbors. Board member George called an emergency community meeting for 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. By 6:45, the room was packed beyond capacity. I've never seen anything like this, George said as he called the meeting to order. We need to address what happened today and determine appropriate action. Margaret sat in the front row, somehow still projecting confidence despite dozens of hostile stares. I filed a legitimate complaint after being attacked, she insisted. I have the right to feel safe in my own community. Show us these alleged bite marks, someone called from the back. Margaret held up her arm with what looked like red marks. Right here. The dog lunged at me when I was simply retrieving my mail. That's when Mrs. Jenkins stood up. I've got something everyone needs to see. She connected her phone to the projector, and suddenly everyone was watching footage from that morning. The video clearly showed the mailbox area from 7:30 to 8 a.m. Margaret appeared alone, checking her mail at 7:47. No Ethan. No Max. No attack. A murmur ran through the crowd. That footage could be doctored, Margaret protested weakly. I have footage from my house showing the same thing, said Mr. Chun. And I was there, added Mrs. Jenkins. Nothing happened. George cleared his throat. That's disturbing enough, but we've also received this. He held up a medical report. This is from the county hospital emergency room. It shows that Ms. Hayes was treated at 6:30 a.m. this morning, before the alleged attack, for an allergic reaction that caused red welts on her arms. Margaret's face drained of color. But there's more, George continued grimly. The board received an anonymous email this afternoon with some troubling information. He projected a series of documents on the screen. These records indicate that Margaret Hayes has a 19-year-old son named Adam, who was diagnosed with autism at age 3. According to these records, she institutionalized him at age 5 and has had minimal contact since. Gasps echoed through the room. Someone whispered, "She has a special needs child, and she abandoned him." "That's a lie," Margaret shouted, standing up. "Those are private medical records. This is illegal." "Is it true?" I asked, struggling to comprehend this revelation. "You have a son with a disability, yet you've been terrorizing my disabled son?" Before she could answer, the clubhouse doors burst open. A tall young man with dark-rimmed glasses entered, followed by an older woman. "Adam," Margaret whispered, her voice suddenly small. "Hello, Mother," the young man said, his voice flat but clear. "Ms. Peterson from the Lakeside home thought I should come. She says you're hurting another special needs child." The room fell silent as Adam approached his mother. "You said service animals weren't real? You said they were fake. But I have one now. His name is Cooper." Margaret seemed to collapse in on herself. "I was protecting you," she stammered. "People treated you differently. They stared. They judged us." "You were protecting yourself," Adam replied. "You were ashamed of me." The caregiver stepped forward. "Adam has flourished with his service dog. He's attending community college now." Something seemed to snap in Margaret. "I did what I had to do," she shouted, her composure completely shattered. "Do you know what it's like? The stares? The whispers? The pity? I worked too hard to build a perfect life to have it ruined by." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was revealing. George cleared his throat. "I think we've heard enough. The board will now vote on whether to suspend Ms. Hayes from her position pending a full investigation." The vote was unanimous. As security escorted a now-sobbing Margaret from the clubhouse, Adam approached Ethan. "I'm sorry for what my mother did," he said simply. "Your dog is beautiful. May I pet him?" As Ethan nodded and guided Adam's hand to Max's head, I realized we had uncovered something far darker than HOA tyranny. We had exposed a woman who had spent years running from her own shame and taking it out on anyone who reminded her of what she'd abandoned. The wheels of justice turned surprisingly quickly after that night. By morning, 2 different investigations had been launched, one by the state's Disability Rights Commission and another by the county prosecutor's office for filing false police reports. News vans lined our quiet suburban street. What had begun as a neighborhood dispute had become a symbol of something larger: discrimination against service animals and the people who depend on them. Reporters approached us daily, but we kept Ethan mostly shielded from the media circus. "Dad, do I have to talk to them?" he asked after the 3rd news crew knocked on our door. "Not a chance," I assured him. "This isn't about publicity. It's about making sure what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else." 3 days after the community meeting, we received an unexpected visit from a legal team representing the state attorney general's office. They weren't just interested in our case. They had uncovered a pattern. "Ms. Hayes has done this before," explained a lead attorney, spreading documents across our dining room table. "We found settlements with 3 previous homeowners associations in 3 different counties over the past decade." The documents revealed Margaret's shocking history: moving into communities, gaining control of the HOA board, then systematically targeting and driving out residents who didn't fit her vision of a perfect neighborhood. Her victims included families with special needs children, elderly residents with medical equipment, and minorities. "She's used HOA violations as weapons," the attorney explained. "But she's never faced real consequences because she always settles confidentially and moves on before criminal charges can be filed." "Not this time," I said. The prosecutor was building a case for criminal harassment, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Meanwhile, Adam, Margaret's estranged son, had transformed from victim to powerful advocate. News channels featured his story alongside ours, creating a media firestorm about discrimination. With his service dog, Cooper, always at his side, he provided a devastating sworn statement that left hardened attorneys in tears. I wasn't allowed to eat dinner with my parents when guests came over, he testified, his voice steady despite the painful memories. Mother installed a lock on the outside of my bedroom door when her friends from the country club visited. She told them I was away at camp, even in December. 48 hours later, the judge issued an emergency restraining order against Margaret. She was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of not just Ethan and Max, but any service animal in the county, an unprecedented legal victory that made national headlines. That same day, the HOA board called for a special election. The results were not even close. Margaret was permanently removed from her position, and the board immediately passed new guidelines explicitly protecting service animals and accommodations for residents with disabilities. But the most satisfying moment came when our lawyer called with news about the civil case we'd filed. "They want to settle," he said, sounding almost disappointed. "Margaret's offering a substantial amount if you'll sign an NDA." "Not interested," I replied immediately. "This needs to be public record." 2 days later, Margaret's attorney came back with a better offer: a public apology, full payment of our legal fees, and a donation to the Service Animal Training Center where Max had been trained. "And one more thing," I added. "Community service hours, specifically working with disabled individuals and their service animals." The judge loved that amendment. Margaret would spend the next year experiencing firsthand the value of service animals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As the case concluded, we learned Margaret had put her house on the market. A for sale sign appeared overnight, and moving trucks arrived soon after. Her perfect lawn, once the envy of the neighborhood, went unwatered and began to brown. A small but satisfying symbol of her fall from power. "Is she going to jail?" Ethan asked when I explained the outcome. "No," I said, "but she's facing financial penalties and mandatory community service. And she'll have a record now that will follow her if she ever tries this again." "Good," he said simply, his hand resting on Max's head. "I just want her to understand. None of us expected what would happen next." 6 months passed. Our neighborhood transformed into something better than before. The new HOA board, led by George and Mrs. Jenkins, created what they called the Max Rules, guidelines ensuring accessibility and inclusion for all residents. On a bright Saturday morning, Ethan and Max led the first annual walk for service animal awareness through our community. Nearly 100 people joined, including several families with service animals who had recently moved in, drawn by our neighborhood's new reputation for inclusivity. As the walk ended near the community park, I noticed a familiar figure waiting by the gazebo: Officer Dawson, the animal control officer who had hesitated that fateful day. "I just wanted to see how you and Max were doing," he told Ethan, kneeling to pet Max. "I quit animal control last month. Started working with the service dog training program instead." "Because of us?" Ethan asked. "Because I never want to be put in that position again," Dawson replied. "Your bond with Max showed me what these animals really mean to the people who need them." As Dawson walked away, Ethan turned his face toward the sun. "Dad, where's Margaret's house from here?" "About 2 blocks that way." I pointed, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. "Why?" "I heard something interesting from Adam last week," he said. "She lost the house." It was true. After the legal settlements and fines, Margaret couldn't afford to keep her home. But the story didn't end there. A local nonprofit had purchased the property at foreclosure auction and converted it into a service animal training facility. Where once stood the symbol of exclusion, now stood a beacon of hope. Life has a funny way of coming full circle, I told Ethan as we walked home, ready for some lunch. Ethan paused, his hand on Max's harness. "You know what I realized, Dad? The woman who tried to take my eyes ended up opening everyone else's." As Max guided him confidently forward, I knew Ethan had gained something precious from this ordeal, not just security in his service animal rights, but wisdom beyond his years. Sometimes, the people who try to break us end up making us stronger than we ever thought possible. The story of Ethan, Max, and Margaret Hayes became a rallying cry for service animal rights across the country. Our neighborhood, once divided, became a model of inclusivity and compassion. And as for Margaret, she faded into obscurity, her perfect life unraveled by the very secrets she had tried so hard to hide. But for Ethan and Max, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, independence, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his guide dog. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.